We will never turn our back on a single Scot.
We've got to wrestle with those challenges.
This is the same nonsense we have heard time and time again.
This is our country. Let's fix it together.
I'm Chris McCall. I'm the Deputy Political Editor at the Daily Record, and I'm standing in as host today for Paul Hutchin, who's enjoying some time off somewhere far away from the Glasgow office of the Daily Record. Now, joining me in the studio, we have two esteemed colleagues from the world of Scottish journalism. We have John Ferguson, the editor of the Sunday Mail, and Douglas Dickie, the content editor at the Scottish Daily Express. Now, kicking off today's episode, I thought we'd talk a little bit about a poll out today which had some interesting results in it, but one in particular about a party that has no leader in Scotland. It has no discernible programme of policies in Scotland. It held its last press conference outside a chip shop in Carlton Road in Glasgow, and its deputy leader didn't appear to know the names of his own councillors despite standing for a photograph with them just minutes before. I am, of course, talking about Reform UK. Now, there was a survey out today by Survation. The short summary is that Reform was on 17% of the constituency vote and 16% of the list vote. And if that was replicated at the Holyrood election next year, that could give Reform as many as 14 MSPs. Now, Douglas, I'll come at you first. What is it about Reform, despite all the caveats I've just said there, no policies, no leader in Scotland, what is it that's appealing to people, do you think?
Well, I think we can assume you're not a fan anyway, Chris, with that. But yeah, I think it's almost this anti-politics. Reform are seen as these anti-establishment upstarts. Whether you agree with that, that's the image they've got. The main parties, trust in the main parties is at an all-time low. I think they're seeing a certain amount. I don't think Reform are comparable to Donald Trump in terms of policy, but what I do see is, over in America, it didn't really matter what Donald Trump was doing to a lot of his supporters. I mean, you didn't even mention the fact that Reform's going through a bit of a bitter civil war at the moment between Nigel Farage and Rupert Law, and yet they are absolutely flying in the polls. They're flying in the polls in Scotland. A lot of people like to think that we're different, that somehow we would be immune to that kind of populism. It's not happening. And we also see with the poll that they're attracting younger voters.
That's right.
Kind of 16 to 24-year-olds who feel disillusioned, they feel left out, they feel left behind by the kind of political establishment. I think that's going to be a major problem for Reform next year, even if polls continue. This is just getting their vote out, because 16 and 24-year-olds are less likely to vote. But, on the surface of it, it presents a major problem for every party other than the SNP, who ironically are going through this charade of trying to get rid of Reform, or this anti-Reform conference. John Swinney must be delighted that Reform are doing so well here, because they're going to hand the keys to Bute House to the SNP, because they're splitting that unionist vote. Although there comes a point, but we seem to be getting close to it, where Reform could legitimately say, actually, it's if you vote Conservative that you're risking giving those keys to John Swinney. But ultimately, the Tories, Labour and Lib Dems remain the big three unionist parties in Scotland, but they've got to be sitting there, really concerned about this. The Greens as well. I know they were doing quite well in that poll, but the actual, obviously no one's going to switch from Green to Reform, but as we were discussing before we came on air, the arithmetic of it, the way it works, the list vote, Reform could end up taking seats from the Greens. Yeah. It's such an incredible, situation, and it really looks like they're going to shake things up.
John, how much of Reform's success in the polls in Scotland to date do you think is down to Nigel Farage? Because he is, of course, the person most associated with the party, but it seems to me that Reforms are, they're almost kind of, moved beyond Nigel Farage. In a way, he could almost be hindering the party up here. Is that fair, do you think?
That certainly is Elon Musk's view of things. I mean, I think what this poll did really more than anything was to confirm what we kind of knew already that the reform thing is real. It's happening. They're on the up, and not just across the UK, not just in England. They are going to make a significant dent in the Scottish Parliament elections next year. And as you say, that's despite having no leader and no discernible policies. I think, though, we do sort of know the policies that we know what we're going to get, isn't it? It's going to be a tough line in immigration, despite the fact we know that the Scottish economy needs immigrants. There's going to be a tough line on the gender stuff. There's going to be a tough line against any kind of net zero policies. We're going to be told that we're killing the economy by, worrying about wind farms and sustainable jobs. And there's going to be loads of this rhetoric that we've seen in America around the corruption and waste in conventional politics. And, that is quite a potent mix. And it's difficult to really see. I think that the only danger really to the rise of reform at the moment is potentially from within. Like you say, there's been this tension between Nigel Farage and Lowe, and it's, whether there's something happens that causes them to implode. If not, then it's difficult to see them getting less popular between now and the election, and it is a major problem for really every. I mean, the SNP. I take your point. They will be pleased to see others having their votes split, but Reform are going to take votes off of the SNP as well. And it's a question, isn't it, for everybody? How do you meet that challenge? It used to be that young people, by and large, tended towards Labour, tended towards, if not Labour, more radical left-wing parties. But now it would appear that young people are actually veering off into this sort of far more right-wing ground, and it's very difficult, to rise to that challenge for anyone. And I think for Labour in particular, they're in this really difficult position now where they're stuck between the SNP and Reform, and how do you meet both those challenges with one policy platform? It's a very difficult position that Anas Sarwar finds himself in now.
What's your interesting there, John, when you said that they will take votes from the SNP? I think you might be right, because I think the same, the same factors that are pushing the Reform rise were partly responsible for, the push of the yes vote in 2014. Disaffected people who feel left behind, feel left down, and the SNP were able to build this idea of them being the anti-establishment, the anti-politics. It always went beyond politics. I remember they had, Elaine C. Smith appearing on debates and whatnot. It's that same kind of momentum that Reform have got behind them. So I don't think, even though I think John Swinney will be happy, obviously delighted with the poll, he shouldn't be complacent, because there's plenty of people who vote SNP and they're only really voting SNP because they believe in independent Scotland, but their image of an independent Scotland might look more like a Reform image of an independent Scotland than an SNP image of an independent Scotland.
And I think we can also, there's the similarities in that you get the feeling it's a very broad church reform. I think you've got nationalists in there, you've got unionists in there, you've got left-wing, right-wing, the whole lot. It's just, if you feel disaffected and that the traditional political parties are corrupt and aren't serving your interests, then you vote for Reform. And the SNP have done great out of that vote in the past as well.
Well, I actually saw John Swinney along with other reporters this morning in Grangemouth, and we all asked them about this poll out today showing rising support for Reform. In the context of course, you'll remember a few weeks ago at Butte House, John Swinney had lots to say about the rise of what he called the far right and, alluding to Reform. But today he only wanted to talk about, unsurprisingly, how good the poll was to the SNP. He wouldn't be drawn on Reform. I mean, I put it to him, is this poll proof that maybe not all Scots are listening to your warnings on Reform? Are they ignoring them? Have they heard them and decided, well, you know what, I'm going to, ignore you anyway? I mean, we should obviously put this in the context of that Reform are still below 20%. But obviously for a new party that currently has no MSPs, that's pretty much unparalleled, really. So how it impacts on the Parliament next year after the election, we really don't know. I mean, we talked a bit before we came on air about who could be Reform's MSPs. We could have quite a few inexperienced people in there now. Obviously, there are inexperienced politicians in every party. That wouldn't just be exclusive to Reform, but you know, they have obviously positioned themselves as doing politics kind of differently. So whether they would be actively trying to challenge what they may view as a cosy consensus at Holyrood by maybe kind of upending conventions, I kind of guess it remains to be seen. Kind of moving on away from Reform to the other big announcement of the week at Westminster. Liz Kendall, the Working Pension Secretary, she announced a pretty comprehensive, a shake-up, I think is how it was put, the biggest shake-up of welfare in a generation, which could cut, she claims, $5 billion off the welfare bill annually by 2030. I should say we don't have the actual figures on how they'll do this until Rachel Reeves makes her spring statement, but I believe we can hear a little bit from Liz Kendall yesterday just now.
Millions of people who could work, trapped on benefits, denied the income, hope, dignity and self-respect that we know good work brings. And taxpayers paying millions more on the costs of failure, with spending on working age sickness and disability benefits up $20 billion since the pandemic, set to rise by a further $18 billion by the end of this Parliament to £70 billion a year. And it is not like this in most other comparable countries, where spending on these benefits since the pandemic is either stable or falling, whilst ours continues to inexorably rise. This is the legacy of 14 years of Tory failure.
Now, without going into the nuts and bolts of welfare reform, because we should say that the personal independence payment in England and Wales, that is being phased out in Scotland, and there is a separate benefit paid to people via the Social Security Scotland agency. Without going to the nuts and bolts too much, I wondered what your perception of what Liz Kendall said yesterday and how you think it will land with voters in Scotland. John, I'll come to you first. What did you make of what Kendall said, and do you think is there sympathy, do you think, amongst voters that the welfare bill is too high, that people are, like, we can't sustain the number of people on benefits? Do you think there's support for that? So
I think yes, there is support for that, primarily among people who don't claim benefits. It's an interesting one. If you look at the figures in this, it's very difficult to avoid the conclusion that this is a real problem that needs to be tackled in some way. I mean, it's actually quite. It's when you see how much of the total amount of public spending in the UK that's going towards these sort of benefits is astronomical, and the projections are for it to go up and up and up over the next few years. So something probably does need to be done, and it does. You get the feeling that Labour are wanting to tackle this from a position of genuinely believing that it's a problem that needs to be dealt with. Now, that's one thing, but it does just feel like electoral suicide for the Labour Party to be the one to do this. It was when it was George Osborne and David Cameron cutting benefits. That was their core vote. Don't claim benefits in the first place. A lot of Labour voters do, and a lot of Labour voters are broadly supportive of a larger welfare state and the state, coming in to help people who are disabled. So it does feel like it's a very hard sell for Labour. You heard Liz Kendall there talking about young people who are trapped in a sort of a benefits trap and needing out of that trap. I doubt you will find many people who are getting their benefits who are cut to will be saying, thanks, Liz, thanks for freeing me from this benefits trap. That's just not how people are going to feel about it. People are going to feel very upset. One thing I think this is really interesting will be how we, the media, respond to it. I can remember in the past when it was the Tories that were cutting benefits, cutting disability benefits. The Daily Record, for example, ran a huge campaign around criticising the sort of the ATOS tests and all of that sort of stuff, and I think it made a real difference. It's going to be very interesting this time around to see whether, I mean, the right-wing media will. It's difficult to see how they're going to have a problem with any government cutting benefits, cutting the welfare bill. It's going to be interesting to see how the left-leaning media respond to a Labour government cutting benefits, whether they broadly accept that this is something that needs to happen and they allow them to get on with it, or whether you see a lot of negative coverage of what they're trying to do.
I mean, I did see, for example, Andrew Neil in the Daily Mail saying that this basically doesn't scratch the surface, so that's the kind of the right-wing view. They're not going to give Labour any thanks for it. But Douglas, I wonder what your take is, because John made the point about the Conservative core vote traditionally not being in receipt of benefits, but the reality is obviously as well that, you know, the welfare bill and the number of different benefits that we have, that it's, you know, everybody knows somebody that's, you know, receiving some kind of payment like this. You know, it's not just an issue that can be, you know, divided along class lines. Everybody, you know, families, every family has people that are in receipt of some sort of benefit, and will probably be quite worried about this long term. Do you not think about?
It sounded like John was throwing down the gauntlet to you at the Daily Record there, Chris, in terms of, you know, how you guys are going to approach it. But yeah, I think there was maybe shades of Tony Blair's New Deal back in '98. Was it '98? You know, that was based on this idea that we should help people back into work, and you know, at the time it was very unpopular with some of, you know, his core vote. There was a famous NME front cover with Blair on it. You know, you ever feel like you've been conned? And it does seem to be a pitch to the right of the party. I think, you know, we've just been talking about the fact Labour are going to losing votes to reform. Is it a pitch to reform voters? I don't think it's going to make any difference to your reform voters. I don't think reform voters are moving from Labour to reform because of you know, the welfare state.
Though interesting, a lot of reform voters would appear to be in low income brackets and people who, a lot of them probably are claiming benefits.
Is it an attempt to pitch to kind of soft Tories? On the surface of it, Labour cutting the welfare budget is not words you really expect to hear, although I guess, you know, they would argue that actual spending's going up. But what it does up here, obviously, is it creates yet another headache for Anna Sarwar, you know, 12 months out or 14 months out from an election. It's going to have a knock-on effect, potential knock-on effect on the Scottish budget. I don't think we'll find out exactly what until the spring statement. Yeah. But you know, it just seems it's not been met with the same sort of vitriol as the winter fuel stuff. Yeah. Even the farmers' tax, but obviously that was a very kind of niche issue. But, you know, the winter fuel statement, the winter fuel payment stuff certainly seemed to, you know, irk people that wee bit more. I think Labour might be hoping that this one kind of goes under the radar a bit. It's obviously big news right now, but I do wonder if you know, by next week this might have.
I think you're touching on something really interesting when you talk about the potential impact on Scotland's budget, because this isn't just going to be a problem for Labour. John Swinney's going to have to wrestle with this as well. If it's actually going to be his choice whether he implements the same type of cuts in order to deal with a budget cut that's passed down through Barnett consequentials, then that's huge. So, you know, is he going to do that, or is he going to look at other things like free uni tuition, the winter fuel payment that he claims he's going to reinstate, all of these things? It's about choices, isn't it?
Absolutely.
I think Liz Kendall made a couple of interesting points yesterday, one of which was that the current welfare system that we have is effectively the system imposed by 14 years of Conservative government, and it would almost be un-Labour like to leave it in place, that effectively Labour had to reform it in some way, and it's been put under huge pressure, as you say, John, by just the rise of applications for all kinds of benefits. And I think the particularly troubling thing for Labour is that, they obviously, particularly under Starmer, really want to position themselves as the party of workers, promoting people into work. And I think they're generally alarmed by the number of people who are leaving school and for whatever reason are moving straight on to benefits, medical support as well. And the figures, like the longer you're on benefits, the less likely you are ever to enter work. So, you're looking at, potentially people who are 16, 17, and if they don't enter the workplace by, say, the time they're 21, there's a really depressing statistic suggesting they'll never join the workforce. And at a time when we have an ageing society and the number of people, particularly in Scotland, the number of people of working age is actually shrinking year on year, it's, I'm glad it's not me that has to try and square this.
It's an odd pitch, isn't it? We must reform 14 years of the Tories giving out too many benefits.
Yeah.
It's not where you would expect to be.
I do agree with the two of you, though. I mean, Labour can't ignore the criticism, and it would be remiss of me to mention a story that I wrote today about Neil Findlay, former Scottish Labour MSP, very much of the left of the party, very firm supporter of Richard Leonard when he was the party leader in Holyrood. He's been out of Holyrood since 2021, but he took the decision this week, after 35 years of membership, of leaving the Labour Party. And, obviously, if you're listening to this podcast, you probably are quite invested in Scottish politics, but I think that, it does speak volumes that Neil felt he had to do that. And also separately today, Carol Mochan, who is the Scottish Labour health spokeswoman, so a front bench MSP within the party, she was extremely critical of what Liz Kendall was set out yesterday. So there is real unhappiness within the Labour Party, within members, aside from, the general public and the people who receive these benefits who are very worried about it. So I don't think this is an issue that's going to go away. We will get more detail from Rachel Reeves next week on how this is actually going to play out in terms of finances. And then obviously it will take even longer to see how it will hit the Scottish Government's budget. But leaving that issue to the side for now, I wanted to move on to two sort of related issues, broadly united by the SNP. So a couple of things. A third of current SNP MSPs have announced they will not be seeking election next year. So I'm going to come on to why you think that is, why you think so many SNP MSPs have chosen to leave Holyrood. But the best known of that contingent is, of course, Nicola Sturgeon, who I thought we could talk about for a short period, because today she's announced that her new memoir will be out in August, and it will be entitled Frankly. And in the copy that's been doing the rounds today, I believe she has described it as a book that will be full of, quote, mistakes and triumphs. So Douglas, turning to you first, what mistakes and triumphs of Nicola Sturgeon's reign are you looking forward to this book?
First of all, frankly, my dear, we don't give a damn, because it's going to be self-serving, full of blatant omissions. She's going to be ignoring probably the biggest Scottish political story of the past 5 years, albeit for legal reasons. But yeah, look, and in some ways I'm fascinated to see what she's got to say for herself. I think a lot of people will be most interested in her relationship with Alex Salmond and how that broke down. Be interesting to see if she's made any revisions given Alex Salmond's sad death last year. But I think that's what people are going to be wanting to dive into, the decisions she made during the pandemic, the decisions, the gender stuff I think is going to play a part in it. But yeah, I mean, look, she's obviously needs some money, so she's looking to cash in, and it will just be 400 pages of her telling everyone that she was right. It kind of reminds me of Brian Clough. She'll have a conversation, they'll have a conversation and they'll agree that she was right all along, and I think that's what it's going to be. It's going to be a justification for because I can't really see her accepting responsibility for her.
Before we come to you, John, just to remind ourselves that Nicola Sturgeon has been at the forefront of Scottish politics for quite a long time now. I believe we have a clip of a much younger Nicola Sturgeon dipping her toes into the world of politics.
In black. Can I ask George Robertson what the Labour Party will do when Scotland votes once again against the Tories en masse? We already have a Tory-free Scotland. What we need now is a totally free Scotland.
Right, let's just take...
So, John, will you be queuing up overnight to get a copy of this memoir?
I mean, I'm sure it will be an interesting read. I think it's called, frankly quite an odd title for a book, and whether just how interesting it is will be determined by how frank she's really willing to be. Like, I don't think you talk about it being. She said that she'll be going over her mistakes. I suspect that we'll be concentrating on what she perceives as the triumphs more than the mistakes. And yeah, it's all the stuff that you suspect she'll probably be trying to avoid, that people really want to know about, i.e. Operation Branch Farm, relationship with Alex Salmond. That these are the things that people really want to know about. Okay, and just finally, on that, the sheer number of SNP MSPs that have decided to seek other opportunities next year, or enjoy a well-earned retirement. I saw it being denied that, quote, the SNP was suffering a talent drain. Would you agree that there is a talent drain from the party, Douglas?
Well, they would need to have some talent in there before it was drained. But no. Obviously, there are some good, MSPs leaving, people who've been stalwarts of the party for many years. But given what we were discussing earlier with the poll, it's not like loads of their seats appear to be under threat. It seems to be a very strange time for so many to be quitting it, but it does feel like a real end of an era. That Salmond Sturgeon, even though John Swinney is completely linked to that kind of era is coming to an end. We're 10 years on from Indy Ref, so more than 10 years on from Indy Ref now, when SNP had such a surge, especially at Westminster. A lot of that momentum's fallen away. I think people accept that we are, at least a decade away from the constitutional question of a really dominating Scottish politics again, and the SNP need to reset. But I think there is a worry for John Swinney when you look at the experience it's going. Who is going to replace him? You look at what's going to be left. I know you've got people coming potentially from Westminster, but it's going to be such a changed team, and we're not just talking about backbenchers here. We're talking about cabinet secretaries, including people like Mary Goujon, who's reaching the kind of peak of her political life. She's someone who's she's kept herself out the spotlight, and I mean that in a good way. She seems pretty capable, and yet she's made the decision to stand down as well. So we're not just talking about people in their 50s, 60s who maybe think maybe now's the time for a rest. Although you've got others who are wanting to hang about. Colin Beattie, by all accounts, wants to, although he seemingly faces a challenge for the nomination. So, it definitely is a headache for John Swinney. He'll obviously deny it, but these people need to be replaced, and an awful lot of them, the replacement candidates are going to get elected to Holyrood if we've got to believe the poll, and he's got to pick his front bench team from that.
John, why do you think it is that so many of these MSPs are choosing to go?
I think as journalists we're always looking for a scandal, and I think my sense is here that there probably isn't really one, and that it is just a generation of politicians who have been in there for a long time. They kind of sense now that independence isn't around the corner. They've got decent pensions built up, and they want to go off and do something else with their time. It's interesting to hear that the Scottish Daily Express has already accepted that John Swinney will be the man picking the next cabinet. You're already worried about who he's going to have in his.
I'm a pessimist, John. I'm a glass half empty, so it certainly looks that way right now.
Yeah. But I mean, it does just feel like there's it's people that genuinely are moving on, despite the fact that actually, against the odds, the party seems to be in pretty good shape at the moment, and a lot of these people would have retained their seats quite easily. For John Swinney, yes, it's a headache in terms of that sort of brain drain and, you know, who you're going to replace your big hitters with if they win the election. But it's also kind of solving a problem for them, isn't it? Because there was clearly going to be blood on the walls with all of these people who lost seats at Westminster wanting back into to politics, wanting Holyrood seats, and it's kind of freeing up a lot of constituencies and places on lists for a lot of these people that have found themselves out of a job. So it's I think Nicola Sturgeon is a kind of a special case. I think she's got a lot of other things to think about and hasn't really been particularly present at Holyrood over the last sort of few months. But yeah, I think the rest of them just want out of it now.
Yeah, I mean, as someone that visits Holyrood regularly, I can kind of sympathise with that. But I think that it's just about all we've got time for today. Obviously, later in the year, when we see Nicola Sturgeon's memoir and we've read it, we'll no doubt do a special episode on that landmark publication.
I can't wait.
But for now, from Douglas, from John and myself, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.
We will never turn our back on a single Scot.
We've got to wrestle with those challenges.
This is the same nonsense we have heard time and time again.
This is our country. Let's fix it together.